According to CNN, Iranian state media is reporting the first death sentence linked to recent protests in the country has been issued by an Iranian court, convicting the unnamed person of, quote, enmity against God and spreading corruption on earth. This comes after reporting from Newsweek stating that the Iranian parliament issued a letter calling for severe punishments of protesters on Tuesday, which was reportedly followed by chants of death to seditionists. Newsweek reached out to the Iranian government for comment.
Iranians have been taking to the streets like never before, protesting the death of a 22-year-old Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, in mid-September. It is believed that Amini was arrested by the country's morality police for reportedly not wearing the proper form of hijab during a visit to Tehran. Amini was allegedly severely beaten while in custody, and those injuries led to her untimely death. According to Newsweek, Iranian authorities have denied the accusation. Human rights lawyer and director of the Mian Group, Mani Mostofi, is here with us to discuss. Welcome, Mani. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So what is going on here? We've heard a lot of rumors, obviously hard to verify, of various death sentences. Are people actually being executed? What's the truth of this?
Yeah, the truth is there's been some misreporting about this, but the situation is quite grim. We're seeing right now the largest protests in the history of the Islamic Republic. There's unity across ethnicity, or across class, across gender, across region. And that has scared authorities, and they've responded the way they typically do, with violence to invoke fear. And one of their tools of violence is executions and the death penalty. The parliament came out and basically called for the execution of seditionists. This has sort of been misreported as every person arrested from the protest, which is about 15,000 people, have been, there's been a call for execution of them. That's not what has happened. But what has happened is around 10 people have had sentences, and between 3 and 5 people now have, execution verdicts. What's alarming about this is that, as far as we can tell, none of these trials have included lawyers. Lawyers are largely being kept out of these cases, which means that our information about it is quite limited. But it's very clear that they're trying to enact severe punishment for anything that they see as dissent, that they're not going to tolerate it.
Can you give us a sense of the scale? You said that there were the largest protest ever. Give us a sense of the scale, what that looks like, and what that means for life in Iran right now.
Yeah, sure. So the easiest thing to do would be compare them to the last episode of really large protests, which is in 2009 after a disputed election. Those were sort of confined to middle-class areas of, the central cities of Iran, like Tehran, Shiraz, and these are majority Persian ethnic areas. But Mahsa Jina, she was a Kurd, and these protests have been taking place in Kurdistan, Baluchistan, Arab regions. They've been in small towns, big towns. They're centered around a women's rights issue, but they're much broader than that. You're seeing southern Tehran, which is working class and a traditional stronghold of government support, and northern Tehran, where sort of middle class, more liberal-oriented populations exist. Like, you're seeing protests in all these areas. You're seeing the student movement, you're seeing the women's movement, you're seeing the labor movement all take part in their own way. And so it's really unprecedented in terms of scope. Now, is it millions of people in the streets at all time? No, it's sporadic protests all over the place, sometimes marking the anniversary of people murdered in the streets, including Mahsa Jina's own murder. But it's been sustained now for a long period of time, and they're trying to figure out how, I think, to most tactfully scare people back into their homes.
Well, yesterday we mentioned reporting that 15,000 protesters were being sentenced to death by the Iranian parliament. We've since learned that was false reporting, stating the false claims that was shared 900,000 times before being taken down.
U.S. Congresswoman Katie Porter tweeted, "I'm deeply disturbed that the Iranian regime is sentencing protesters to death. I continue to stand with the Iranian people in their fight for freedom, and I echo calls for the Biden administration to tighten sanctions and hold the regime accountable." According to the Iran Human Rights Group, Iranian forces have killed over 300 protesters since the start of the uprisings and have sparked solidarity protests around the globe. Mani, I want to ask you, what do you make of the U.S. response, Katie Porter's call to tighten sanctions? Do you think, one, it would be effective, and two, it's a good policy more generally speaking? I know there's a lot of critique of sanctions and whether or not they're sufficiently targeted and if they hurt the people they're intended to hurt. What do you make of their sanction regime so far in terms of its efficacy and whether or not we should continue it going forward?
Well, the main sanction regime we're talking about has nothing to do with human rights. It's always been around nuclear and national security issues. And those are the ones that there's a lot of debate about their efficacy or their collateral impact. And the collateral impact has been documented. It is undermine civil society and ordinary folk. But what the Biden administration does have at its disposal and has been using and should continue to use strategically are these targeted human rights sanctions. And these can kind of create a sense of a deterrent effect amongst some human rights violators as to the fact that they can have their own, they can be personally sanctioned, that could impact them economically, that could impact them in terms of travel, in terms of their children's future. And I think that these tactics should continue to be used, but strategically so based on sound evidence. They should choose the right targets. And it shouldn't just be a free-for-all. We want a lot of people sanctioned, but we want a lot of the right people sanctioned.
And what are the demands looking like from inside of the country, and how likely is it that there will be a kind of positive response?
So it's hard to know exactly what the demands are because this is not an organized movement with a sort of central mouthpiece. What we do know is that the entire range of human rights and economic rights that people want, the dignity and basic ordinary life is missing. The reason Mahsa Jina's death was such a catalyst for this movement was because she was just going about her daily life as a young woman traveling with her family, and it ended tragically because the state feels it has the right to intervene in the smallest thing about, the way you wear your attire. And these types of daily indignities are ones that, millions of Iranians experience all the time. So what people want is an entirely new system that doesn't invade their personal lives, that gives them basic dignities and freedoms. And that's the most we know. We don't know exactly what the protesters want beyond that, because they haven't been able to organize. They have all the potential leadership right now is in prison. And this is the goal of the state in some ways, is to make sure that organization, leadership, development of a platform can't naturally develop out of these protests. So it's a big question. But what we do see is clear resolve. There's resolve on the streets. People are facing enormous amount of violence and serious consequences, as we see with these court verdicts. But they continue to come out and they continue to stand side by side. And that's a pretty inspiring thing to see.
Indeed. Mani Mostofi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you both.
We'll have more Rising right after this.